Attila the Hun. Introduction. The name that still makes people nervous. In the year 452 AD, Pope Leo I rode out from Rome to meet the most feared man on earth. He had no army behind him. He had no weapons. He had only his robes, his cross, and whatever words God might put in his mouth. Waiting for him on the banks of the Mincio River was Attila, king of the Huns, self-proclaimed scourge of God, and the man who had just spent 2 years burning every city in his path to ash. Nobody knows exactly what Leo said. Nobody knows exactly what Attila heard. What we know is the outcome. Attila turned his army around and went home. The man who had sacked city after city, who had humiliated 2 Roman emperors, who had crossed the Alps with hundreds of thousands of warriors, turned around and left. Just like that. It is one of the most dramatic and mysterious moments in all of late antiquity, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about who Attila was. A man so terrifying that his restraint was as astonishing as his violence. Attila the Hun has been called the greatest military genius of the ancient world, a bloodthirsty barbarian, a surprisingly sophisticated diplomat, a psychological warfare mastermind, and the man who did more than anyone else to bring down the Western Roman Empire. He has been used by European cultures as the ultimate symbol of destructive savagery, and simultaneously claimed as a national hero by Hungary, by Turkish peoples, and by several Central Asian nations. He appears in Norse sagas as Atli, in German epic as Etzel, a figure so large he reshaped the mythology of entire civilizations. So who was he, really? Where did he come from? How did a nomadic warrior king from the Eurasian steppe come within an inch of destroying the most powerful political structure in the Western world? And why, having the Roman Empire seemingly at his mercy, did he repeatedly choose not to finish the job? This is the full story of Attila the Hun, the man, the myth, and the world historical earthquake he set off. Chapter 1. The Huns, a world Rome never understood. Who were the Huns, really? To understand Attila, you first have to understand the Huns. And this is harder than it sounds, because almost everything written about them was written by their enemies. The Roman and Gothic sources that describe the Huns are so saturated with fear and contempt that separating fact from propaganda is a genuine scholarly challenge. Romans describe the Huns as barely human short, stocky, with faces deliberately scarred in infancy to prevent beard growth, living on raw meat, warmed between their thighs and the flanks of their horses, sleeping on horseback, incapable of walking properly on the ground. Some of this may have had a grain of truth. Most of it was the ancient equivalent of atrocity propaganda. What we know with more confidence is this: the Huns were a confederation of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who originated somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia, possibly related to the Xiongnu people who had terrorized China's northern frontier for centuries before being pushed westward. They were above all else horse people. They lived on horseback, fought on horseback, and developed a relationship with their animals so complete that Roman observers genuinely couldn't tell where the man ended and the horse began. Their composite recurve bows, powerful, compact, devastatingly accurate, were the most advanced ranged weapons in the world at that time, capable of penetrating Roman armor at ranges that Roman infantry couldn't hope to match. The Huns arrived in Europe in the 370s AD like a geological event, sudden, overwhelming, and permanent in its consequences. They crushed the Alans, a powerful Iranian-speaking steppe people. They shattered the Ostrogothic kingdom in the region north of the Black Sea. And then they pushed the Visigoths, an enormous Germanic people, with their own formidable military tradition over the Danube and into Roman territory. This cascade of displaced peoples, all crashing into Roman space at once, created a crisis the Roman Empire would never fully recover from. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 A.D., in which the Visigoths annihilated a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens, was the direct consequence of Hunnic pressure from the east. The Huns didn't even fight at Adrianople. They just pushed. And Rome fell over. The Hunnic way of war imagined facing an army that never stands still, that fires arrows at full gallop with terrifying accuracy, that retreats when you advance and appears from nowhere when you think you're safe, that has no supply lines to cut, no cities to besiege, no fixed base of operations to destroy. This was the military problem the Huns posed, and Rome had no answer for it. The Hunnic tactical system was built around mobility and psychological disruption. Their standard approach was to shower an enemy with arrows, from horseback advancing, retreating, circling, never committing to close combat, until the enemy formation had been softened up, confused, and demoralized. Then they would suddenly charge with lasso and sword, closing the distance before the enemy could regroup. Against the rigid formations of Roman infantry or Gothic cavalry, this was extraordinarily effective. Roman military doctrine had been developed over centuries to fight other armies that played by similar rules. You formed up, you advanced, you stabbed each other at close range. The Huns didn't play by those rules. The Huns also understood psychological warfare in a way that seems almost modern. The stories that preceded them, stories of impossible speed, of cities destroyed overnight, of populations massacred without mercy, were as much a weapon as their arrows. By the time a Hunnic army appeared on the horizon, the population of whatever lay in its path had often already been softened by weeks or months of terror. Surrender, when it came, was frequently not the result of military defeat, but of psychological collapse. This was not an accident. Attila, in particular, was a master of the controlled use of reputation. The world Attila inherited. When Attila came to power, the Roman Empire had already been divided officially since 395 A.D. into the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, and the Western Roman Empire, ruled from Ravenna. Rome itself had long ceased to be a practical military capital. The Eastern Empire was wealthier, more urbanized, and more administratively competent. The Western Empire was a slow-motion catastrophe. Its tax base had eroded. Its army was increasingly composed of the very Germanic peoples it was supposed to be defending against, and its emperors were shadows of their ancestors' political puppets managed by military strongmen. Into this world the Huns had been inserting themselves for decades before Attila. His uncle Rua, also sometimes spelled Rugila, had extorted substantial tribute payments from Constantinople and used the threat of Hunnic military power as a diplomatic lever. The Huns weren't just raiders. They were a political force that the Roman world had learned, painfully, to take seriously. When Rua died in 434 A.D., power passed jointly to his nephews Attila and Bleda, and then, roughly a decade later, one of them killed the other. History has always suspected which one. Chapter 2. Attila rises. The elimination of Bleda. 2 kings, 1 kingdom, 1 inevitable outcome. We know almost nothing about what Bleda was like. He appears in the sources briefly, co-rules with Attila for about 11 years, and then simply disappears from the record around 445 AD. Our primary source, the Roman diplomat and historian Priscus, who actually met Attila in person and left the most detailed eyewitness account we have, reports the death almost in passing. Attila killed his brother in a hunting accident, or possibly just killed him. The sources are deliberately vague. The Huns themselves apparently weren't eager to discuss it. What's significant is what happened next. The moment Bleda was gone, Attila moved with a speed and decisiveness that suggests the joint rule had been constraining him. He immediately launched a massive campaign against the Eastern Roman Empire, crossing the Danube with an army that ancient sources describe as enormous, sweeping through the Balkans, destroying city after city. Naissus, the birthplace of the Emperor Constantine, was so thoroughly obliterated that years later, Priscus described approaching it and finding the riverbanks lined with the bones of the dead. The Eastern Empire, unable to stop the military onslaught, negotiated a peace that was really a capitulation. Massively increased tribute payments, the return of all Hunnic refugees, and a wide buffer zone south of the Danube that was effectively surrendered to Hunnic control. This is the Attila who enters history fully formed, ferociously effective in war, but also calculating and patient in the use of his victories. He didn't try to occupy the Eastern Empire. He didn't attempt to replace its government. He extracted the maximum economic and political concession available, then stopped. This patterned devastating military campaign, followed by negotiated settlement on favorable terms, followed by peace until the next campaign repeated itself throughout his reign and reveals a strategic intelligence that goes well beyond simple raiding. The man himself. What Attila actually looked like. Thanks to Priscus, we have the only genuine eyewitness physical description of Attila that survives. And it's not what you'd expect from someone nicknamed the Scourge of God. Priscus attended a diplomatic mission to Attila's court in 448 or 449 AD and left a remarkable account. He describes Attila as short, with a broad chest, a large head, small deep-set eyes, a flat nose, a thin beard going gray, and a swarthy complexion. He moved with a swagger, casting his eyes about with an air of pride. At the banquets, which were elaborate, almost theatrical affairs, he ate and drank from wooden cups and plates, while his guests were served on silver and gold. He wore plain clothes without ornament, while his lieutenants were covered in jewels. This studied simplicity was not austerity, it was performance. Attila was demonstrating that he needed no decoration to dominate a room. Priscus also gives us something rarer, a sense of Attila's personality. He describes him as quick to anger, but also capable of restraint, sharp in negotiation, with a sardonic sense of humor that he deployed at the expense of the Roman diplomats squirming in front of him. He was clearly enjoying himself during these encounters, the performance of supreme power, conducted from a position of total confidence. One scene Priscus describes is almost comic. A Roman plot to assassinate Attila was uncovered, and instead of executing the conspirators, Attila returned them to Constantinople with a cool message making clear he knew exactly what had been attempted. The message was more terrifying than any execution could have been. Chapter 3. Attila versus the Eastern Empire, Diplomacy as War, the Tribute Machine. The relationship between Attila and the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II was the geopolitical black comedy of the 5th century. Theodosius was, by most accounts, a mild-mannered, scholarly man who preferred theology and calligraphy to warfare. Attila was Attila. The dynamic practically wrote itself. After the devastating Balkan campaigns of the late 430s and early 440s, Theodosius agreed to tribute payments that were, by any measure, staggering. The initial Treaty of Margus in 435 AD had set payments at 700 pounds of gold per year. After the Second Great Campaign, this was renegotiated at sword's point, effectively to 2,100 pounds of gold per year, plus a one-time payment of 6,000 pounds as back payment of arrears. To put this in perspective, this was a significant fraction of the Eastern Empire's entire annual revenue, paid annually to a man who was essentially running an extremely sophisticated protection racket at civilizational scale. And Attila kept finding new leverage. When Roman officials failed to return Hunnic refugees or defectors as required by treaty, Attila responded with immediate military demonstrations. When the tribute payments were late, he sent icy diplomatic messages that were really ultimatums. When Theodosius tried to have him assassinated twice, Attila returned the conspirators alive, which was somehow worse than any reprisal would have been. He had turned the entire eastern frontier into a slow-motion negotiation in which one party held all the cards and the other kept trying to figure out which card table they were sitting at. The court of Attila, nomads who built an empire. One of the most persistent misconceptions about the Huns is that they were a disorganized horde, a mass of violent nomads with no culture, no politics, and no administrative structure. Priscus's account of Attila's court destroys this misconception completely. What he describes is a sophisticated multicultural court that functioned as the political center of an empire stretching from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea. Attila's seat of power, described as a large settlement of wooden buildings in the Hungarian plain, somewhere near the modern Danube Bend, contained not just the king's own elaborate wooden palace, but the residences of his numerous wives, his sons, his chief vassals, and a constant stream of ambassadors from Rome, Constantinople, and various Germanic kingdoms. The banquets Attila hosted were carefully choreographed political theater. Seating arrangements communicated status. The order in which guests were served reflected diplomatic standing and Attila's own behavior. His silences, his occasional jokes, his studied indifference to gold and silver was a continuous performance of supreme authority. His court included Roman-trained secretaries who drafted his letters in Latin and Greek, Gothic chieftains who commanded contingents of his army, and Hunnic nobles who managed the tribute collection from subject peoples across an enormous territory. It was not the court of a raider. It was the court of a king who happened to conduct his foreign policy primarily through military terror. The distinction matters because it explains why Attila's empire, for all its apparent fragility, held together as long as he lived.